The diner hummed with clinking
I
plates and the
think
low
someone is
murmur of
following
evening
us.
chatter. Jake Mitchell sat across from his
Don't
son,
look back
Tyler,
right now.
when the boy's voice dropped quiet. "Dad, can she eat with us?" In the far corner, a woman named Sarah Bennett sat by herself, one bowl of soup in front of her, her eyes holding a tiredness she couldn't quite hide. Jake didn't answer right away. He stood up. What happened next quieted the whole room and changed the way his son looked at him for good. The rain had softened to a light drizzle by the time Jake Mitchell pulled into Riley's diner on a Tuesday night. He shut off the engine and sat there a beat before opening the door, the kind of pause a man takes to shift gears from work mode into whatever comes next. Tyler was already unclipping his seatbelt beside him, 19 now, tall and quiet, back from his sophomore year of college and still crashing in his childhood bedroom because rent in town made no sense on a student budget. They'd been showing up to Riley's once a week for almost 6 years, ever since the funeral, ever since the house had stopped feeling like somewhere either of them wanted to sit down for dinner. Inside, the place smelled like coffee and browned onions. The window booth was free, like it usually was on weeknights, and Jake slid into it with the ease of a regular. He ordered the meatloaf without glancing at the menu, and Tyler asked for the same. Jake ran a modest commercial real estate company 2 towns over, nothing flashy, just steady, built on 12 years of tight contracts and a personal rule about never owing anybody anything. He balanced his checkbook every Sunday and never let a problem sit past midnight. People at his office called him fair. Nobody ever called him warm. He'd decided long ago that warmth and precision didn't usually share the same room. Tyler spotted her first, a woman at the two-top near the back wall, tucked into the dimmest corner of the room, sitting like someone who'd picked that seat on purpose. Her brown hair was knotted up, but coming loose after a long day. In front of her, one bowl of soup, one glass of tap water, nothing else. She held her spoon the way people hold something they're trying to make last. Tyler leaned toward his dad, voice low. "Don't look yet. Woman 2 tables back." Jake waited half a minute, then reached for the salt and let his eyes drift past her without stopping. He clocked what Tyler had, the thin meal, the way she kept her bag pressed against her hip, like someone who'd learned not to set it down, the exhaustion that ran deeper than tired. He'd seen that same look on his late wife's face back in the months they were scraping together money for treatment. "She was already sitting there when we pulled in," Tyler said. "I watched her through the window. She hasn't ordered anything else." Jake picked up his water, kept his voice even. "She probably came in out of the rain." "You know that's not it, Dad." Jake didn't answer that one. He flipped his fork over once and set it back down. Part of him wanted to do what he always did in moments like this. Nothing. Not from indifference, but because caring without thinking it through was how a man got dragged into other people's lives in ways he couldn't control. He'd built his whole adult life on one rule: take care of your own and give strangers their privacy. That was the line. That was how things worked. The waitress swung by the woman's table and asked if she needed anything else. She shook her head and gave the kind of polite smile that meant she'd already decided the answer before being asked. Jake watched her hand drift toward her bag, then pull back empty, like she'd checked something she already knew the answer to. She went back to her soup slower now, since the bowl was nearly empty and she had nowhere else to be. Tyler set his glass down gently. "Dad, can she eat with us?" This was the moment Jake had both been waiting for and dreading. He knew his son. When Tyler asked something in that quiet tone, it wasn't really a question, it was a measurement. Tyler was watching to see what kind of man his father was when nobody important was around to see it, and Jake had spent too many years trying to be that man to fail the test now. He kept his face still. "It's not that simple." Tyler's voice stayed soft but firm. "It's a meal. It's not complicated." "You don't know her situation," Jake said, not looking up. "That's exactly why I'm asking." Jake exhaled through his nose. The practical part of him, the part that had steered his business through a recession without ever missing payroll, started running the angles like it always did. She might be embarrassed. She might feel insulted. She might think he was hitting on her. She might read it as charity, which, if he was honest, it partly was. 8 ways this could go sideways, maybe 1 or 2 ways it could go right. Not the kind of odds he usually gambled on. But Tyler was still watching him, and the woman in the corner was tipping her bowl now, chasing the last spoonfuls. In another minute she'd set the spoon down and leave. Whatever Jake was going to do, he had less time than he wanted. The diner kept moving around him like none of it mattered. He set his napkin down. "Wait here." He stood up. The diner carried on, forks against plates, a country song drifting from the kitchen speaker, 2 guys laughing at something on a phone a few booths down. Nobody noticed him cross the floor. He walked between the tables with loose hands, like a man walking into a negotiation, except this wasn't one, and he knew it with every step. He stopped a respectful distance from her table. She looked up, and up close her eyes were a tired green with something guarded behind them, the guard snapping tighter the moment she registered a man approaching her alone. "Ma'am," Jake said, "sorry to bother you." She didn't answer right away. She waited. "My name's Jake Mitchell. I'm sitting over there with my son." He gestured, and across the room Tyler lifted a hand in the smallest wave. "We're about to order. Noticed you were just finishing up. We'd like to buy you dinner, a real one, and we'd like it if you sat with us." She studied him a long moment. The guard in her eyes didn't drop. It tightened. "That's kind of you," she said, "but I'm fine." Jake kept his voice steady. "I'm sure you are. I'm not asking because I think you're not." Her reply came back quieter and sharper than he expected. "Then why are you asking?" That caught him off guard, because he'd braced for a yes or a polite no, and she'd given him something harder. She wanted to know his angle. "Because my son asked me to, and he was right to ask." She glanced past him toward the booth. Tyler didn't smile and didn't try to look harmless. He just met her eyes calmly, no performance in it. Whatever she saw there did something his father's words hadn't managed. She looked back at Jake. "My name's Sarah Bennett." "Sarah." Jake gave a single nod. "It's just dinner. You can leave whenever you want." She looked down at her empty bowl, then at the door, then back at him. He could see her running the same calculation he'd just run, except hers carried different numbers, different stakes, different things she couldn't afford to lose. "I'll pay for my own," Sarah said. Jake shook his head. "That's not the offer." "It's the only offer I'll take." He almost pushed back. Men like him usually did. But Tyler was watching, and something steady in Sarah's voice told him this wasn't stubbornness for its own sake. This was a line she'd drawn on rougher days than this one, and she wasn't stepping over it for a stranger in a clean coat. "All right," Jake said. "You pay for your own. Come sit with us." She hesitated one more second, then picked up the bag she'd been guarding all night and stood. Jake led her back to the booth, her footsteps careful behind him, not trying to be small. Tyler slid over to make room. Sarah sat across from Jake with her bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, looking at the menu like something she hadn't let herself consider in a while. Jake watched her and felt, for the first time in a long while, like he'd stepped past a line he'd spent years drawing. He didn't yet know what waited on the other side. Only he knew his son had asked him a question, and the answer he'd given wasn't one he could take back. Sarah ordered grilled cheese and tomato soup, the cheapest hot meal on the menu, and laid a creased 20 on the corner of the table before the waitress had even walked away. Jake saw it and said nothing. Tyler saw it too and gave the smallest nod, telling his father not to argue. That first night's conversation didn't go far. Sarah answered in short sentences, ate measured bites, kept her bag on her lap the whole meal. When the check came, she slid her bill across the table without ceremony and didn't wait for change. She left before they did, with a quiet thank you that landed somewhere between gratitude and warning. Jake watched her step into the parking lot and turn left, away from the row of cars, on foot. Tyler waited until she was out of sight. She walked here. Jake didn't answer. He set his napkin over his plate. He understood what his son meant without needing the rest of the sentence. For 3 weeks after that, Jake thought about Sarah Bennett more than he wanted to admit. Then he stopped thinking about her. Then he saw her again. It was at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. She stood in the paint aisle with a list in hand, comparing 2 cans of primer, the cheap one and the cheaper one. She looked up when he stopped at the end of the aisle, and recognition came with a small, instinctive tightening of her shoulders, like she'd been caught at something.
"Mr. Mitchell," she said. "Jake," he answered. He glanced at the cans in her hand, then back up. "Painting?" she said, one can back on the shelf. "Trying to. Bathroom in my unit has water damage, and the property manager said I could fix it myself or wait 6 months. Her voice stayed even, but he could hear the math underneath it. The math of someone choosing to spend $40 she didn't have, so she wouldn't stare at a stained wall for half a year. He almost offered to send someone over. He almost said he knew a guy who could swing by for nothing. He felt the offer rising in him, automatic and well-meaning, and then he remembered the creased 20 on the diner table and closed his mouth around it. "It's a good brand," he said instead, nodding at the cheaper can. "I've used it on rental units. Holds up fine." Sarah looked at him a beat longer than natural, like she was weighing whether the comment was courtesy or something else. She decided it was courtesy. "Thanks," she said. They stood there a second too long. Then, almost before she could stop herself, Sarah said, "My mom's been sick a while. I'm the only one looking after her." She didn't elaborate, and Jake understood the sentence wasn't a request. It was a piece of her life she'd set down between them, deliberate as someone laying a key on a counter to prove her hands were empty. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. It was the only thing he could think to say that wasn't more than she'd asked for. After that, they kept crossing paths, the grocery store on the corner, the laundromat near her apartment, the hardware store again on some other errand. None of it planned, but Jake noticed he'd stopped avoiding those places either. He knew the town's rhythm well enough, and Sarah's rhythm too, and he'd started drifting into spots he'd never noticed before. He didn't call it intention. He didn't call it anything. Tyler was the one who said it out loud first. They were driving home from Riley's one Friday night, 3 weeks into what had become a cautious kind of acquaintance, and Tyler reached over and turned the radio down. "You know you keep finding her," he said. Jake kept his eyes on the road. Small town. Tyler let that sit. Sure, small town. No edge in it, but no agreement either, and Jake found himself pressing the brake harder than necessary at the next stop sign. The 4th time they crossed paths, Sarah was at the diner alone again, there to order takeout. She spotted them and would have slipped out without a word if Tyler hadn't stood up and waved her over. She came with the same cautious steps and ate a bowl of soup at their table, paying for it herself. Tyler carried most of the conversation that night, asking about the book tucked under her arm, the route she walked home, whether she'd caught the meteor shower the week before. He kept things light without making them shallow. By the end of the meal, Sarah had laughed once, briefly, and the waitress, who'd started recognizing all three of them by now, refilled her water without being asked. Sarah started letting them in by inches. She told them she worked 2 jobs, mornings answering phones at a dental office, evenings cleaning a medical building near the highway. She told her mother lived in a small assisted living facility on the edge of town and that the cost kept climbing every year. She said it the way she said most hard things, flat, like reciting a weather report. She didn't tell them how close she'd come to losing her apartment back in February. Jake pieced that together from one offhand comment about a near rent hike and the way her hand froze on her coffee cup when she said it. The first slip happened on a Wednesday. They were eating dinner at the diner when a man in a navy suit stopped by the booth on his way out and clapped Jake on the shoulder. "Jake, the Henderson deal closed clean. Whole block. Nice work." Jake said something polite back, the kind of thing he said 100 times a year, and the man walked on. When Jake looked up, Sarah had set her fork down. She wasn't looking at him coldly. Worse, the warmth that had been building over the last few weeks had thinned by a degree, and he could feel it. "Whole block," Sarah repeated. Jake kept his voice level. "Commercial real estate, it's what I do." She gave a slow nod. "I know what you do. You told me you ran a small firm." Her tone wasn't accusing. It was something worse, the tone of someone who'd just realized they'd skipped a word while reading a sentence. "I do run a small firm, 7 employees. The Henderson building was a one-time thing." She looked at him a long second. "Right," she said, and went back to her soup. The conversation moved on, but the air at the table didn't. She kept showing up, but after that night, she started paying before the check even arrived, sometimes before the food did. She turned down the rides Jake had started offering on rainy nights. She used the word fine more often, and Jake, who'd spent his career reading small movements across negotiating tables, knew exactly what that meant and chose to ignore it because somewhere along the line he'd decided he was going to help her. He hadn't told anyone, not even Tyler, but he'd decided.
The first thing he did was the back rent. Sarah had mentioned in passing that her property manager agreed to waive a January late fee if she stayed current the rest of the year. Jake called the management company Monday morning, paid the fee anonymously through his firm, and asked them not to say where it came from. The receptionist hesitated, then agreed. Jake had the kind of voice on the phone people agreed with. He hung up and felt no guilt. He felt useful, and that was a feeling he trusted more than most. The second thing was the job. A friend of his, a woman named Diane, who ran a small accounting practice one town over, had been mentioning for months that she needed an office assistant. Jake called Diane, described Sarah without naming her, and said he thought she'd be a good fit. Diane asked if there was anything she should know. "Pay her well," Jake said. "Treat her like anyone else. Don't tell her I called." Diane laughed and said she hadn't heard him sound like that in years. He didn't ask what she meant. The third thing was smaller and, in some ways, worse. Sarah had mentioned, almost offhand, that the assisted living facility was about to raise its monthly rate again, and that her mother had started talking about moving back home so Sarah wouldn't have to keep paying. She said it the way she said most hard things, a fact, no ask attached. Jake called the facility the next morning and told the billing office he wanted to cover the difference between the old rate and new one anonymously for the next 12 months. The billing officer, who'd clearly handled this kind of arrangement before, agreed without many questions. For a few weeks, things between them were easier than they'd ever been. Sarah landed the job at Diane's office. She came to dinner one Friday and told Jake and Tyler about it, with something close to lightness on her face, and Jake ate his meatloaf and said he was glad. He told himself the lightness was the reason, not the lie. Tyler watched them both across the table and said very little. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, Sarah called Jake to tell him the facility had reached out. They'd decided not to raise her mother's rate after all. Some old policy adjustment had come through. There was the smallest crack of relief in her voice. Jake made a sound meant to be surprise and said he was glad to hear it. He thought he'd pulled it off. He thought he'd pulled all of it off. He was a man who'd spent 20 years closing deals quietly, and he'd started mistaking quiet for kindness. The thing that broke it was the smallest and most careless move of all. The facility sent Sarah a thank you letter the following month, addressed to her as the family contact. Near the bottom, it mentioned the facility's gratitude for the continued generosity of its private donors and listed the dollar amount contributed on her mother's behalf. Reading it at her kitchen table on a Thursday evening, Sarah recognized the figure, close to an amount Jake had once mentioned offhand as the size of a quarterly charitable gift his firm made. She might not have connected it, except she'd spent her whole adult life learning to read the shape of help that came with strings, and this shape was familiar. She didn't call him. She showed up at the diner Friday like always, but earlier than usual, already seated in the booth when Jake and Tyler walked in. Jake saw her face and knew before he sat down.
Sarah waited until they were both settled. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The diner was busy, which made it worse. Everything she was about to say would be said over the noise of other people's ordinary lives. "I want to ask you something," Sarah said, "and I want a straight answer." Jake set his keys on the table. "All right." She placed the facility's letter between them, the dollar figure showing. "Was this you?" Jake looked at the letter. For half a second, he thought about saying no. The half-second told her everything. "Yes." She gave a slow nod, confirming something she'd clearly suspected longer than tonight. "The late fee on my rent in February, was that you?" "Yes." She kept going, same even voice. "The job at Diane's office." "I made a call. She made the decision. The work's been yours." Sarah nodded again. "But I wouldn't have been in the room without you." Jake didn't have an answer for that. He didn't have an answer for any of it. Sarah glanced at Tyler for a moment, her face softening briefly before closing again. Then back to Jake. "I told you the first night I'd pay for my own. Do you remember?" "I remember." Her voice didn't rise. "I told you what the rule was, and you decided it didn't apply to the parts of my life you weren't watching." "I was trying to help." "I know. That's what makes it worse." She picked up her bag. The waitress approached with menus, and Sarah lifted one finger, polite, and the waitress veered off. Sarah slid out of the booth and stood at the end of it, not looking at Jake, looking instead at the window, the gravel lot beyond it. "You didn't give me a meal," Sarah said. "You wrote a story about me where I was the person who needed saving, and the worst part is I didn't even get to read it before everyone else did." Jake started to say her name. She gave one shake of her head before he got it out. "I was already doing it, Jake. I was already doing all of it,
and every time you stepped in, you took a little of that away from me, and you didn't even know you were doing it because it cost you nothing." She didn't slam the door on her way out. The diner kept moving. The country song on the speaker changed to a different country song. Tyler looked at his father across the table, and for the first time in a long time, Jake couldn't read his son's face. He looked down at his hands, resting on the table the way Sarah's had that first night, folded as if holding something that wasn't there anymore. The drive home was quiet for a long stretch. Jake kept both hands on the wheel. Tyler stared out the passenger window at the dark shoulder of the road. They were almost to their street before Tyler spoke. "Dad," he said, voice level, "did you help her, or did you make her feel worse?" Jake didn't answer right away. The question wasn't shaped for an answer out loud. It was shaped to be carried home and kept. He thought about it that night after Tyler had gone up to bed. He thought about it the next morning at the office when his assistant brought him coffee, and he caught himself studying her hands the way he'd once studied Sarah's, and realized he'd been doing that for years, quietly measuring the people around him, deciding who he was going to fix without ever asking. It was a habit he hadn't recognized in himself until Sarah named it. He thought about his late wife. He thought about how, in the last year of her life, he'd taken over every decision in the house, the bills, the appointments, the slow shrinking list of things she still got to choose for herself, and how she'd let him because she was tired. Once, near the end, she'd told him, "You're so good at this, I almost can't tell anymore which parts of my life are still mine." At the time, he'd taken it as a compliment. For 3 weeks, Jake didn't see Sarah. He didn't call her. He didn't drive past the laundromat. He and Tyler kept going to Riley's, sitting in the window booth, eating without saying her name. The waitress asked once if their friend was coming, and Jake said, "Not tonight." She didn't ask again. In those 3 weeks, he found the silence at the table harder to sit with than he'd expected. What he did instead was quieter than anything he'd done before. He called Diane at the accounting office and told her the truth, that he'd asked her to hire Sarah as a personal favor, and that he wanted her to know in case the arrangement ever needed to change. Diane listened, then said, "Jake, she's the best assistant I've had in 5 years. Whatever you started, she finished. The job's hers." Jake thanked her and hung up, and sat at his desk a long time. He called the assisted living facility and asked them to stop the contribution at the end of the current month and to send no further letters mentioning a private donor. He called the property manager and asked that if Sarah was ever late again, they call him only if Sarah herself gave him his number. The property manager, a tired woman who'd heard plenty over the years, said she'd never had a man call back to take a favor away. Jake said he hadn't expected to either. He never told Sarah what he'd done. He understood, finally, that the point wasn't confession or forgiveness. The point was to stop standing where he'd been standing. 4 weeks passed before he saw her again. She was in the produce aisle at the grocery store, reading a rice bag label the way she'd once read the price tags on primer cans. She looked up, and the guard came back into her face, slower this time, like something she had to put on rather than something she already wore. Jake stopped at the end of the aisle and didn't come closer. "Sarah," he said, "I don't want anything. I just wanted to say, I heard you that night at the diner. I heard you." She didn't answer right away. She set the rice back on the shelf. "All right," she said. He nodded and turned to go. Her voice caught him from behind, quiet. "Jake."
He turned back. Sarah was looking at the rice in her hand, not at him. "If I ever ask, I'll ask. Until then, please just be a person I see sometimes." "All right," he answered. It was the only answer that was hers to keep, and he handed it back to her clean. 2 months later, she asked. Her car broke down on a Sunday, the 14-year-old sedan she'd been holding together with patience and a cheap mechanic, and she called him from the shoulder of the road. The first thing she said was, "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking for a ride home. That's all." "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Jake said. He drove out, gave her the ride, and didn't call the mechanic. When she got out at her apartment, she said, "Thank you." He said, "Any time you ask." He meant the second word more than the first. After that, things came back slowly. She started joining them at Riley's again, not every week, but enough. She paid for her own meals every time, and Jake stopped trying to talk her out of it because he'd finally understood the creased 20 she'd laid on the table that first night hadn't been pride. It had been the cost of sitting at that table as herself. He had no business trying to refund it.
Almost a year later, on another Tuesday evening, the three of them were back in the same window booth. The rain was thinning the way it had the night this all started. The diner was busy. A woman walked in alone and took the two-top by the back wall, the seat where the lighting was worst, and ordered a single bowl of soup. Her bag stayed pressed against her hip, the way Jake now knew to look for. Tyler saw her first. He looked at his father across the table, and this time he didn't lower his voice. "Dad," Tyler said, "can she eat with us?" Jake looked at the woman. He looked at Sarah, sitting across from him with her own meal in front of her, and saw she'd already noticed, too, watching the woman the way only someone who'd once been her. Jake didn't stand up the way he had the first time. He didn't cross the room like a man closing a deal. He set his fork down and said to the table evenly, "Let's ask her, all three of us." Sarah met his eyes, and something in her face that had stayed guarded for a long time loosened just enough. They stood up together. They didn't bring an offer, they brought a chair. When the woman by the back wall looked up, careful, tired in the way Jake now recognized instantly, he didn't say, "Let me." He said, "There's room at our table if you'd like it. You order what you want, you pay for what you order. That's the whole deal." The woman looked at the three of them, at Sarah most of all, and after a long moment she nodded.